Hello and welcome to Turning Point Tactics, the competitive Kill Team 40k podcast, focused on giving you the strategies and tactics to seize initiative every turning point. I'm your host Ryan, and I'm joined by the War to my Crusade, Conor. How you doing this evening, Conor?
I'm good, thanks, Ryan.
We are also joined by another special guest, the captain of Command Point UK, number 3 in the UK, Mark, aka Rashis96. A man so nice, if he punched you in the face, you'd thank him for it. How you doing this evening, Mark?
Great, thanks for having me.
Awesome stuff. So for the people who aren't in London or might not know exactly who you are, would you be able to give a little bit of an intro of who you are and why you're on the podcast?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Mark. I go by Rashis96 on Discord. I've also got a YouTube channel as well. I've been playing in London for a fair while now. Started out back with the previous edition around Prime and Nexus. Really got into it deep in a more competitive sense. Been hitting a lot of events this year. So I've been to 13 since this edition came out. 10 podiums so far, 73% win rate. So it's going okay. Not quite as good as you guys, but pretty happy with it so far and enjoying the game a lot.
What you're saying is with your win rate, if you were a kill team, GW would nerf you, is what you're saying.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's been 55% is the gun rate, so I would get hit hard with the nerf, but I'm afraid.
I think that's like a really good thing to look at as well. Is like the average player is probably sitting at that 50% win rate. When you start going right of that to your 55 to your 60%, that's when you're looking at being quite a good player. And then over 70%, I think is really, really strong for kill teams. So you're winning a heck of a lot more games than not. And the other thing I would say is consistency of podiums. I think you're always podiuming, really. It's very rare when I don't see you in one of those top 3 slots, whereas I sort of do a little bit of peaks and troughs with my performance, maybe.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely the case. So many times now I've come second or third behind you at a tournament. No, generally I've been very consistent. I'm quite pleased with that.
Sweet. So, out of interest, big competitive game. Obviously, 40k itself is really, really competitive. But why do you like Kill Team? What's the competitive side of Kill Team that's drawn you to that over, say, another competitive game system?
Yeah, sure. So I'll make a comparison to 40k first and just say it's much shorter, so you can get games in under 2 hours. I find that a lot more fun. It means you can get more reps in, more variety as well, and you're not locked into playing the same teams all the time as well. So if you had a 40k army, you'd kind of just collect one thing, new models would come out, maybe you swap out some of the old stuff. In Kill Team, you can swap back and forth and try lots of different things. I think for me personally, I played 40k a lot as a kid. I enjoyed it and then took a bit of a break and then getting back in. Kill Team's just a much easier game to get into, that kind of more bite-sized format. And this edition's really good as well. So some of the changes they've made versus the previous edition, I think have been big improvements. So we're talking things like alternating activations is obvious, but then things like multi-kills, so those weren't really a thing in the previous edition. They removed the morale phase and the injury roll, so taking out some of those mechanics which are a little bit more random and a bit less clean. I think it's in a really good place. I'd compare it to other games at the minute which are quite competitive, things like Marvel Crisis Protocol. I think this is a better game, things are less swingy, there's a good player base for it, it's tied into that 40k lore as well. I think Kill Team as a whole is really good at the minute, and I'm really enjoying it.
I think you touched on a really key point there. If you're playing competitive 40k, for most people, there are some people out there who probably can afford to have many 2,000 point armies, but for most people, the money you spend on like a single 2,000 point competitive 40k army is like buying every single kill team that exists, and it's probably the same amount of painting time. So I think a lot of people, when they look at kill team, they go, it could get quite stale because there's not too much in, let's say, intercessors on their own. But it's like, well, you're right, but you can just pick up another team, and that's how you get your variety. So it's not just a single faction variety, like list building, like there is in 40k, but it's actually playing with a huge breadth of factions that can play completely differently, and that I think is where we get a lot of fun. So we're talking about teams. I know you've played quite a few. What teams are you currently playing, and what made you choose them over others?
Yeah, sure. So the ones at the minute I'm playing are mostly Pathfinders, Hunterclade and Gallopbox. I started out a bit earlier in the edition playing Commandos and then Void Dancers when they came out. Really enjoyed those, but I think over time the meta has moved, new teams have come out. So we're talking things like Hunterclade, Intercession, Gallopbox have all come out, and those are quite hard counters for Commandos and Void Dancers. And generally I'm trying to avoid hard counters, so if we're talking about a 73% win rate, trying to go deep at tournaments, I think picking a team which has got that kind of flexibility to avoid those really hard counters is quite important. So with the things I'm on at the minute, like let's take Pathfinders as an example. I don't really think they have too many bad matchups. Hunterclade have some, and then Gallopbox are probably a bit more of a wildcard team for me at the minute. And generally, when I'm picking teams, there's two things I look for in particular. So I'm looking for consistency and high movement. So with consistency, you picked up on this in a previous episode on your top tips. Guns don't kill people, guns with rerolls do. And that's definitely true. So you're trying to, first of all, increase your probability to kill by getting that higher consistency. And then it also gives you more say in your planning. So you can say, this has got a high probability, so I can base my plans more around that rather than it being a coin toss. And then I don't really know what's going to happen and I have to make more contingencies for that. So rerolls are definitely something I look for. There's other ways you can get consistency as well. So we're talking things like double fight, double shoot, auto retains as well. So I think something like intercession, you're just throwing more dice. So even if you fluff the first roll, you can roll some more, and then you're probably getting what you want in the end. And generally, I think consistency is something which is quite important to place high in tournaments. So if we're talking about RNG as being impacting you in a negative way, so if you get good dice some games and you win, bad dice other games and you lose, that's not really what you want if you're trying to do well in tournaments. You want to say, I want to remove the dice as much as possible, and then that's going to let skill come through. So really you're trying to use skill to replace whatever RNG might be in the game already, and you're trying to mitigate that as much as possible. And then in theory, the better players should be winning. So if I was to take an example of this, I would say Corsairs, for example, are really not consistent. So I took them to a tournament in Manchester. I rolled hot all day. That was a great time. But counter argument, if I'd rolled poorly, there is not a great deal you can do about that. You can kind of try and score points with them, just focus on the winning condition, tack ups. But consistency is really important for what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The highs and lows of Corsairs is unbelievable. You're like, oh my god, I rolled a 6, I got rending, it's all happening, so much damage in the next game. It's like, I can't even get a single hit through. For the love of God, please, someone help me. But yeah, it can be pretty rough on that train.
Yeah, definitely. I remember in my third game of that tournament, I was playing into intercession. I fired the blaster, one-shotted the marine. Fired the fusion pistol with the other guy, one-shot another marine, and I'm like, this is turning point 1, I've killed 2 guys, that's GG. It's just unbelievable.
And you think that would be it, and then potentially you go into turning point 2 and you can't hit a goddamn thing. You're like, oh no, like what? Why? There should be a sealed deal. I mean, I sort of had a lot of fun with Corsairs, but Serkan, you know who you are. He just, every single time I went to a tournament, would gatekeep me with Harlequins so hard. I just could not figure out how to win that matchup. I mean, it's better now that Jess has been nerfed, thank God, because beforehand, I was like, I can't beat you in melee, I can't beat you in shooting. You're faster than me. You're better at playing the objective. I don't know what I'm doing. And also, Serkan's a fantastic player, so I'm like, if you like, I need you to like completely mess up this game for me to have any chance, because I don't have the tools. And he didn't mess up the game, so I just lost every time. But that's what you get when you're playing against some really good players.
Yeah, for sure. So I've talked a little bit about consistency. The second thing that I'm looking for when picking a team would be high movement. The reasoning for this is it lets you flex into doing different kind of tactical plays. So a lot of players are quite strategic. They'll plan several turns in advance what they want to do and be able to execute that regardless of what your opponent does, or set up in a way to mitigate whatever your opponent's trying to do. I prefer to play a little bit more free, so quite often I'll just drop my guys into an area and then I'll be trying to use the high movement to give myself options and do things that other teams can't. So if we're taking Novitiates as a team that I didn't get along very well with because they didn't have that kind of high movement, so they've got a couple of sources of APL, they can move the penitents a little bit further, but they've got no kind of strat phase dashes, and then general movement tricks like climbing ropes, for example. I found that quite tough. Just giving yourself the flexibility and the freedom really to go and do whatever you want is really nice. I think overall I'm just trying to maximize the agency that I have. So when I'm setting up, I'm trying to say, I want to be able to do things. I'm going to give myself as many options as possible to be able to go out and do those. The high movement as well, it can compensate for mistakes. So if you do things a little bit imprecisely, you've got a bit of give where you want to try and flex and do something slightly different to what you had planned previously, and you can compensate for that. And then the final thing with high movement is it lets you go positional. So I was talking about consistency as a way to remove dice. High movement lets you do that as well. So I can say I could fight this guy and try and kill him and then maybe stand on a point. But maybe instead I can just sprint over here and do attack up, or I can lock something up in combat so now they can't get onto a point. Having that high movement lets you do these kind of things that other teams aren't able to do.
And it really helps you be able to direct the flow of the fight as well. So I found that, so one of the key skills that everyone talks about is threat ranging, which is knowing exactly how far your opponent can move and sitting just outside of it. And that's so useful to be able to go, well, with a movement buff that I've got on my team, my threat range is larger than yours, so I can sit at a range where I'm safe, but your opponent isn't. It's so hard to play around with that. So any sort of teams that have that movement shenanigans are always in a good place. And as you say, like, you can confirm 100% what your movement is, right? Like, you know what that is. There's no dice involved, unlike old edition with the dice for charging and stuff. So I'm glad that that's gone. It's all very, very precise and understood, which is nice. And it was interesting, just right at the very beginning of what you were saying, you were talking about which kill teams you were selecting and the things that you're looking for to be able to win tournaments. And Conor and I were talking about this sort of yesterday as well. But I had exactly the same sort of mental process when I was going up to Manchester to play in their big 40-man tournament, because I thought there'd be lots of Gelapox there. Turns out there was only like one or two. I didn't play them, but I hadn't had any practice in that matchup. And we'd been to a team tournament the weekend before, and I'd seen how scary Gelapox could be. And I thought to myself, there's only one team that I think has the tools to be able to deal with this reliably, and that was Pathfinders. So I swung to Pathfinders as my safe bet to take the matchup that I didn't know much about. But now I think it's much better than what it was. The new balances have come in, which is nice. Cool. I think you talked a lot then about ability to do movement, ability to shoot reliably, and all that sort of stuff. So how would you describe your play style? How are you moving around the board and doing that sort of stuff? Because to me, I think we have a very similar play style, or from what I've seen anyway. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think you've touched on it there with the movement and saying you can have bigger threat ranges than the other team. So one of the things I'm trying to do is really force through non-reciprocal shooting and damage output. So for example, if my charge range is bigger than yours, I can charge you, but you can't charge me. So that's just going to let me get free output potentially. You can do that with shooting teams as well. So I'm going to shoot you and then dodge back into obscurity. I really enjoy those kind of plays where you're putting out damage and not getting hit back in return. And in general, I think I'm quite trying to push into asymmetry as well. So if we were to take something like chess as an example, that's something which has no RNG and it's perfectly down to skill. So whereas I'm trying to eliminate RNG as much as possible, I'm still trying to force through asymmetry. So what I mean by that is I want to shoot my opponent's melee guys, I want to fight their gunners, for example. And I think that kind of high movement and non-reciprocal play is something that lets you try and do that. So with melee models, for example, I'll happily sit just outside of charge range and then try and wait them out a little bit, generally picking teams with high number of activations, let the opponent go first, and then I'll react to that and then try and push through as much free damage as I can.
Yeah, and like as you said then, the best way to avoid being diced, particularly when someone is shooting at you, is to not let them roll the dice at all. So that asymmetric shooting or non-reciprocal shooting, whatever we want to call it, is so good for that, because it's like your opponent could just be rolling sixes all day, but if they're not actually able to get the shots off, then it doesn't matter. But yeah, it can be real rough if you're just relying on feel no pains and generic, saving throws, whatever else, and then you just don't make them. I shot my dad's Gelapox leader the other day, and I don't think he made a single feel no pain on turn one with the Architect Beam from Star Striders.
Nice.
Did like 18 wounds straight away or something ridiculous, and I was like, that is like leaving him with one wound is rough, because I'm like, they're supposed to be quite durable, but when you don't make a single 5-up, they really aren't. So yeah, that can be pretty rough. I personally think that your playstyle is the most reliable playstyle, and is the way I like to play the game as well, because it avoids, as I said, those roller coaster moments where you go from really highs to really lows when you play aggressive. I know Conor does not necessarily do the same playstyle, because he likes to get all up in people's faces. Is that fair enough, Conor?
As you know, I've got a lot of stuff on. I like to tie the game off in about 10 minutes. So.
win or lose, we're going in big. We'll see what happens, right? Roll some dice.
But, I like the chess analogy that Mark put forward there, and I like because he touched on the high number of activations, and one of the things we've often mentioned is the chess term zugzwang, and the idea that you basically give your opponent no good moves, and you can do that with when you've got a high number of activations just by passing, and often then your opponent is forced to do, like if you're, I don't know, a horde team into an elite team, you can just pass, and they're forced to do a move they don't really want to do, and then that allows you to then attack that.
Yeah.
Attack the model that they move or shoot or do something with. I like the chess analogy going on.
I remember you introduced me to the phrase of zigzagging, and it's like it's so true. If you're playing against a good player, you can just be staring at the board, think to yourself, none of my guys are in range to do anything that I want to do, but all of theirs are. So there is no good moves for me to make, and it's that horrible moment where you know, oh, I've just been completely outplayed. And you can only really do that with, I think, movement and sort of high movement, good positional play, and understanding threat ranges. So that's pretty good. So obviously that's your play style. You said at the beginning you've been involved in quite a few tournaments. What tournaments have you been involved in, and how successful have you been this year?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've been to most of the big ones. There's UK Games Expo in Birmingham. That was run by the Warhammer World Events team. That was around, I think, just shy of 40 players. Been to London GT, which is again kind of similar. Been to Warhammer World 3 times. Playing a lot of tournaments in London as well. So there's the LWG series, which has been ongoing. There was the end of season invitational. I went to that and got to the final as well. And then we also took a trip one day to Manchester for one of the smaller ones. And I know you've been back since. Yeah, generally all the tournaments have been really good. I think the London TOs are still leading the way in terms of their terrain layouts and the map packs that they're putting out. And the general organisation. But I think as we've gone around and been to more events, I can see everybody's up in the game. Things are going really well. I think at the minute with the UK tournament scene, it's definitely growing. There's more tournaments popping up from other places, not just London, Warhammer World, Manchester. Yeah, it's going okay. Went to Warhammer World a few weeks ago now. That was the 3rd time this year. So Warhammer World are putting on more events, so they're getting bigger. I think that one was 66 players in the end, which is pretty massive for the UK. Came second at that one, so yeah, pretty happy overall, and it's going well.
I definitely want to come back to touch on that most recent Warhammer World Tournament, because there's a lot to talk about there. But just to talk about the Manchester scene, I like the fact that we went up for, it was a 16-player Into the Dark, and they managed to source 16 full boards, which was awesome. Not 16, sorry, 8 full boards, whatever it was, 9. I forgot how they had, and that was like a real tournament. And I think what the interesting thing was, and it opened my eyes a little bit, was, I don't know if they've been doing it the whole time or if it's a recent thing, but the TO up there, Dan and I think Ben TOs as well, so Dan and Ben, they had like challenges every little round. So it might be first melee kill, or it might be first grenade kill, first multi-kill, first person to table your opponent, whatever it is. And each of those like gave a little reward, which I really like, because it was, for a lot of people, you might lose like one game at the start of the day and you feel like you're out of it, but it just kept giving them people a little bit more to like, oh, well, okay, I've lost that, but I can now win this and I can go and do this. So it was really cool seeing how they've implemented a small change, which I think is something that London could do to make it more interesting for everyone involved, because not everyone is there to try and you know, go for first place like we do. Some people just want to have that, right, I'm going to try and get this grenade kill first thing, and I'm going to nuke someone, and that can be really fun as well, which I quite enjoyed. And then looking at how they've grown to that 40-player tournament I went to most recently, I think you're right. The London scene has managed to do a really good job of crowd sourcing terrain and stuff, and with the map packs and everything like that. That was really good for last edition, but I think trying to get 20 boards of entirely appropriate kill team terrain and have it all laid out perfectly is a massive ask. And they did a really good job. Like I think most of the boards had like the official kill team terrain, and then a few of them didn't, but the majority did. And the maps were pretty well laid out. Ben, one of their sort of top players, was going around and checking the boards to make sure they weren't too imbalanced, which was nice. So I think you're right. If they can crowdsource terrain like London can, then I think Pete's got some real challenges up in the north in the competitive scene. And they've got a tournament coming up actually in January, I want to say. I think it's like the 14th or something like that. We'll have to try and get him on the podcast at some point to talk about it, because that's another great competitive scene. I think we need more reps up there, because it's definitely getting much better.
One of the nice things as well about crowdsourcing terrain, I remember in the last team tournament I went to, they actually had a award for the best painted terrain, and I've never seen that before. And I actually think it's really cool because terrain is just something that we all take for granted, really. But some people put a lot of love and care into their terrain, and it looks amazing. So it's nice to see that it's recognised and people can get awards for that as well.
And there were some absolutely incredible terrain sets that people have made for ITD. I'm looking at it thinking to myself, I was so annoyed filing that ITD terrain down that the thought of painting it was terrifying me. And people are just like, yeah, it is incredible what they've done. Some of them were just absolutely beautiful, and it makes the game play a lot better in a way, just having that lovely presented board that you can work with. Yeah, awesome stuff. So I said we're going to come back to it because the last Warhammer World Tournament was probably, it was 66 players, was it, I think?
Yeah, so originally I think they had 60 tickets, they added a few extras at the last minute and then had a few drops, so it leveled out at 66 in the end. And
that was, I think for us, probably one of the most competitive tournaments that's happened in the UK, I would say, because we had a huge influx from the Spanish scene with people like Ace and Carlos turning up, who are, pretty much well renowned as being the best players in the game, number 1 and number 2 on the ITC at the moment. And obviously you managed to go undefeated there and come second. So what was it like to face off against, because I think you played 3 Spanish players on your way to the finals. What was it like being a Warhammer World and playing against the Spanish's best?
Yeah, it was it's pretty rough, to be honest. They played very, very well. So Warhammer World in general is a little bit different in terms of format to what we'd have in London. So the terrain's a little bit more dense, and then we're using TAC Ops as a tiebreaker instead of strength of schedule. So where I was playing these guys, I played into David Carpio's Legionary, Ivan's Star Striders, and then Paco's Void Dancers. Whereas some of those might sound like a bit more comfortable matchups for Pathfinders, so Legionary and Star Striders in particular, they really bled me dry in terms of TAC Ops. So I came second by 1 VP versus third place. I could have easily dropped down to like 4th. I was dropping TAC Ops left, right and centre in those games. In particular, I remember in the Star Striders game, it came around to turn 4, he's got 1 guy left, I'm all over the board, about to signal beacon, triangulate the back edge, do something else, jump on all the points, and he just goes, okay, I've lost already, but I'm just going to make things as difficult for you as possible. And I think that really sums up the attitude that they've got. So even when things haven't been going well at all, they're still playing to the maximum, and yeah, he cost me a TAC Op point, which very nearly cost me my placing in the end. It was really
because and we talked about this on previous episodes. Like, you get the win condition at Warhammer World in that tournament is all about TAC Ops. So denying even 1 point or 2 points is huge. And when you start going against good players, they understand the win condition, and they're always making you fight for every single one of those TAC Op points, which can be really, really rough to try and get through. But it seems to have worked out. You managed to get second, beaten only by Carlos with his Navy breaches. I did hear as well that you played one of my local players.
I did. So in the first round, I had a Pathfinder's Mirror versus Jason Zammit. And he came out with a completely on-meta list. It was 10 basic guys, gun drone, 2 Shoutlers, pre-balanced data slate. And then it turns out he's been getting tips from somebody. I don't know who that could be.
Yeah. I was doing a little bit of tournament prep with him. I'm like, right, this is what I think you should do, is try and play it. And it's funny hearing both sides of it, because he was he turned up and he sort of said to me afterwards, it was like I just faced off against you on that, it was Wednesday or Thursday night that we last played. And because, again, exactly the same play style, all that sort of stuff, and he's just like, oh, Mark is so good, and he's so nice. Like, what is this? And I'm like, yeah, I know. He's silent assassin who'll just beat you, and you'll thank him for him at the end of it. But it sounds like you guys had a great game. If anyone don't know Jason, I'll get him on at the podcast at some point. He's like a local TO in Nottingham, and he's running this Nottingham group, and it's growing really well at the moment. They're getting pretty regularly, like 10 people on a Thursday and a Friday night. So, like, it's pretty big for pick up games on a weekday. And then they had a 16-player tournament a few weeks back as well. So they're definitely growing, and I'm hoping that we're going to train them up to be absolute competitive monsters like you and me. We'll see if we can get it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for a first tournament, getting 16 players is really, really good. Like, most scenes, I don't think can try and pull that. You might get like 6 or 8 for a first go, but getting 16 in straight away,
it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's really goes down to Jason's personality, because he is a very vibrant character. I don't know the best way to describe him, but yeah, he is, like, once you've met him, you'll know you've met him. He's a great dude. The other type of tournaments that we've obviously been playing in, so if everyone doesn't know, we are the team of Command Point UK, right? So Conor, Mark, and myself. Mark obviously leading the team for the year. And we got to play in some team tournaments. So do you have any thoughts on those and like how you, or if you prefer them to regular, or do you prefer singles, and what's your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think I like both. Team tournaments probably edging it out just ever so slightly. There's quite a few things which are different with it. So there's, from the tactical side, you've got the pairings. I think those add a lot more interest, as in you might want to put a certain guy as your defender because you want to try and avoid a matchup. That could be a way to dodge a hard counter, or maybe you might be able to just face into something which is a bit more favourable. And really you're just trying to win 2 out of those 3 games. You can try and set yourself up nicely for that. But then I think from the camaraderie side as well, it's always great fun. I have a great time against tournaments with you guys. We sit around, talk tactics in between rounds. It's always funny that whoever gets lumped with the bad matchup and then comes through with a win at the end, or maybe somebody doesn't have such a good time but somebody else bails them out. I think, yeah, it's just a really nice, fun format to just play games in.
And like I remember the last one we did was ITD. I think we kept throwing you into the hardest matchup every time. Just like in you go, Mark. See how you do, and you still managed to win one of them against Galapox, and then lost the other one. But like that was, again, it was our strategy wasn't to win all 3. Our strategy was to win 2 and 1 in that instance. And so by taking away that hardest matchup that could potentially counter the other 2, it's like, well, we should win the other 2 games, or like, not guaranteed, but the odds are in our favour. And if you do win yours, then we're even better off. And if we don't, then it's really no harm. Hopefully next time round we'll put you in some of the easier fights rather than just all the hardest games. Just like, oh, there you go, Mark. Have another hard one.
There we go. Conor, you take the Kroot round 1.
Yeah, exactly. Conor, you can take Kroot round 1.
On a solid side. I've been saying since Galazar dropped. They're the tough ones.
Yeah. Just to double check for everyone listening, that was pre-balanced data slate. So this was when Kroot had no teeth, and he was just bullying them with legionaries, which is a pretty rough matchup for them anyway.
But I love the fact that in the team tournament though, you can lose a match and it's not over. You can still go, right, okay, we lost that. Let's just group together, play it tight, play it cool, and you can still win. Because do you remember the first tournament we went to in Warhammer World? And I think we all lost a match, and we were adamant. We're like, we've lost this. And then suddenly the guy said, yeah, you won. And we're like, what? How did that happen? We lost the match, but
it just takes
it's not over. It's over,
isn't it? And it's so nice just to know that I can mess up this game, but it's not going to run the tournament streak or ruin the tournament streak. That's really nice to know. There might be some competitive monsters out there that can all go, if it was 6-0, all 3 of them over 2 days, sure. But for most people, they're going to drop a game here or there. But being in that team tournament just means that it doesn't ruin your chances, which I think is really, really good. And you touched on it there, the camaraderie and all that sort of stuff as well. It's just a really fun experience. And I agree with you. I think I like both for what they are, like singles tournaments for the individual challenge. But I like the team tournaments because it does have a bit more depth in that mission planning stage of like, right, okay, what's the matchup that we want? I think the one that I remember was so Conor is a monster with legionaries into Imperial Navy. I think he's figured out the matchup and knows how to do it. But everyone else thinks that it's heavily in Navy's favour. So I remember us thinking, I reckon when we go into the old ones team, they're going to try and force that matchup, and I'll be able to take Hunterclade, which I think again is Navy versus Hunterclade. I think is a good matchup for Navy if you know how to play it. Probably quite even, I think. And then we'll throw Hunterclade into Galapox because someone has to take that bullet. And yeah, like we got the exact match that we wanted because we sort of like gamed the opponents, and Conor and I managed to pick up the wins to go 2-1, and that's what we needed to win the tournament. So I think that's a really cool tactical depth that you get from those tournaments as well. Yeah. So obviously, Balanced Data Slate has come out, and it's shaken up a whole bunch of the game. Conor and I did a tier list yesterday on it. But do you have any thoughts on the Balanced Data Slate itself?
Yeah. So my take at the minute is I think GW are doing a really good job. Things that were looking a little bit too strong. 3 of them I was playing already, so Pathfinders, Galapox, Hunterclade all took a bit of a hit. I think that was pretty fair. And generally the buffs have not been huge, so it's been a bit of tweaking there, and then the nerfs as well. Things have dropped down a little bit. Pathfinder -1 operative. I think these are all pretty good changes, and I think the game's in a really good place. I'm glad they're not doing any kind of massive swings where they're changing things massively. So every 3 months, it's a completely different game. It's just little things which I think are quite appropriate. Generally, the changes I agree with as well. I think the only one which you disagree with a little bit is I think Navy could have taken a little bit of a nerf. I think Stims are very strong, and then Brace as well. And Blitz is a little bit too consistent. So being able to guarantee a crit and hit for 1 CP, potentially stacking it with Close Assault, maybe Attack Order as well. I think that's probably a tiny bit too strong. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm interested to see how it plays out over the next few months. I was saying yesterday, I think they are the strongest team because they have all the right tools, but I don't think that they're also quite a difficult team to play, and they only have a few key threat models. So one of the things that they lack is any sort of real range play, and they have to, like turn 1, they have to try and move up to get all their guys in threat range. And if you can play around that and get shots potentially on open board and that sort of thing, I think you can really start to hurt them. I think generically that they're very good at punishing people who play too aggressively. So I think if you can get the right chip damage, you can put them into the right damage ranges that you need. So I think everyone seems to think because they've got void armor, they're like immune to blast. They're not immune to blast. They're just slightly more durable. But if you can get just a bit of chip damage with blast weapons on them and just knock 1 wound off here or there, suddenly their damage breakpoint becomes much, much better. So things like frag grenades, they don't really care, like 2-2 damage rather than 2-3 damage. Okay, whatever. It's still good. It's still enough chip damage just to get them just to the damage breakpoint that you want to then kill them with the right weapon. And I think teams like Warp Cover might have played into them as well, like being able to turn off the dashes. For people who don't know, the way that Navy maintain their durability is basically by not doing regular moves, but by dashing forwards and shooting, and that then keeps their -1 damage. But if you make their dashes 1 inches, they're not getting around, so then you can potentially threat range them better as well. It's not something I've played too much into, and there's maybe a little bit of a tactical analysis that I've got in my head of how to game it, but I think there's play there. But I think you're right, little and often. We'll see if it turns out that they are a bit too strong, then I'm sure GW will just nudge them back a little bit into line. But I don't think they're as terrifying as people make them out to be. I know there was a few comparisons to pre-nerf, on release Pathfinders, and I'm like, it's not the same level as guaranteeing initiative with 4 models before your opponent can do anything. But it's which was disgusting, to be fair.
Oh man, it's not even close or comparable at all. Pre-nerf Custodes, back when people didn't know how to play the game, and Pathfinders were just absolutely ridiculous. Like, they've taken however many nerfs, and I think they're probably still the strongest team in the game now.
Yeah, they're definitely up there. They're, for me, they sit in the top 3. Vetguard, Breaches, and Pathfinders is who I think's up there. Okay, so the main reason why we got you on is to really get some of your top tips, because I think there's a whole bunch of stuff in your head that we want to try and get out to the wider audience, so they get a chance to hear about it as well. I'll hand over to you. What are your top tips, and what sort of things would you recommend to people?
Yeah, sure. So I've come with 5. We'll see however many we get through, and we might need to cut it at some point. But the first thing I think is really important to master with this edition of Kill Team is alternating activations. So this is quite different to the previous version, probably something more in line with other skirmish games at the minute. And the key things for me, the first thing will be don't count on getting first activation. So that is, I'm going to set my Melter Gunner up in a nice spot. If I get initiative, then it's great. I'm going to probably kill something, and that's hopefully going to snowball, and everything's going to go well for me. But if I don't win initiative, then I'm going to be in a rough spot. I think if you're in a tournament and you're trying to roll a dice for initiative, and that determines whether you win or lose, that's not great. Something's gone wrong there. So what I'd be advising in that case is, first of all, you can look at non-reciprocal things. So we talked about it earlier, setting up outside their charge range. Maybe you can get +1 inch move, or ignores reversing, or something like that. So you can charge them, they can't charge you. With the shooting as well, kind of similar thing. And then the other thing I would look at is threat saturation. So this is setting multiple threatening pieces up quite high up the board. And this is saying to your opponent, okay, I've got these 2 or 3 things here. If you go first, you're going to kill one of those. But then the others are going to go, and those are going to wreck you. So regardless of whether you're getting first or second, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. And then the next thing within alternating activations I would hit upon is order of operations. So this is just generally which ones do you want to move with first, versus which ones do you want to go with later in the turn. I think you're probably a little bit better at this than I am. If you want to jump in, maybe you've got something to say on it.
Yeah, so like I think it's another way to get around what do they call it? Paralysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Is like the what models am I gonna do next sort of thing. And the way I look at it is certain models have threats and certain models aren't threats. So there might be models that you're only ever going to do one thing with, and there might be that's a Markerite and triangulate model, or it might be that it's a comms guy that's going to relay an API, whatever it is. There's some models that you're never going to do anything else but one thing, and if you get rid of those activations out the way first, it then keeps your opponent having to maintain honesty, because if your big plasma gun isn't activated to your last move, well, I have to respect that plasma gun until it goes, because there's a chance you're going to kill whatever it is that I don't want you to kill. So that's a really good, I think, way of doing it, as you say, is just understanding when to activate what and holding back those threats until you can use them effectively, because the temptation is so real just to as soon as someone moves out and you have a shot, just to take it straight away. But that shot's already been and gone. You want to wait and see if there's a better target later on potentially.
Something else you do quite nicely, Ryan, as well. When I play against you, you hold back that infiltrate flip, so any one of those models that look like they're concealed could actually be unengaged and ready to shoot me, and it just keeps that mental load on me while I'm thinking about where to move my guys. And they might never flip in the end, but it's stopped me moving to where I want to move to.
Yeah, and a great example of this actually is the new Star Striders with their orbital bombardment. Like, some people try and use that as your first activation kind of thing, but if you wait and hold it out, it is a constant mental load to be able to look at all of those individual models and think, where is this thing coming from? Where's safe? Where's not safe? That's a great way of tying up your opponent's capacity.
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely see that. Another thing I would probably add to that is I would try and target unactivated models as well. So for a lot of battle reports we see, your opponent with their first activation jumps a plasma gun up, takes a shot, and then they're just sat there now. A lot of people will say, okay, that's a plasma gun, I'm going to go kill that right now. Whereas you can kill that later, you can target something else which is going to go and maybe is going to try and shoot one of your guys. You don't have to go straight away for that one which is already activated. And I think that feeds a little bit into the next thing I would hit on with alternating activations as well, which is how to deal with activation control. So if you were to just make a count going backwards and forwards of how many activations each player's got, generally you want to have more than they do. So one of the ways to ensure this is to kill models that haven't already activated. So if you've got 10, they've got 10, but then you kill one of their guys, then all of a sudden they're at 9 and they're on the back foot again. And that can also just give you an advantage in terms of last activation as well. So generally going last is very important. It lets you jump on points at the end of turns without your opponent being able to react. So that last activation, you can get a kill with no return fire, or you can, I'm going to go stand on a point in the open if I get initiative next turn, or if I can strat phase dash away into cover or something. Those become completely safe moves all of a sudden, rather than something where your model's at risk.
Yeah, and I think as well, what's key throughout all of these individual points that you're making is it's different for every team as to how you're playing this, because there's lessons to learn about this as elite players as well. Like, if you play elites, turn one, you have to understand that your opponent is going to have the last turn. Whatever you do, they're going to get to do that. And if they're a good opponent, they're going to save all their big heavy hitters until the very last thing, and they're not going to give you the chance to get the overwatch that you want. They're not going to give you those shots back. So you're actually much better just denying them the shots altogether and maybe staying on conceal. But if you're, let's say, blooded, maybe you want to just threat saturate your opponent, and that's why you're moving your guys up so aggressively, because you're setting up for that turn 2 where there's just too many guys that are in the right place to deal with. So you have to understand the play style that your team is bringing and make sure you play to that play style as well.
Talking about Overwatch, do you guys ever think about, say you're playing as a horde team, making sure that you're activating models evenly across all sections of the board? Because let's say you activate everyone on the left side and then only got the right side left to activate, an elite player could move a model on the right side and know they're going to get Overwatch, and they can't also get shot because you've activated every model there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's such a great point. That is 100%. You've got to keep your threat space, because I know sometimes when I see a model move and end, because that threat's gone away, I think to myself, right, I can now move into that area and not worry about it, whereas before I might have to hold back. So great point. Make sure your threats will be activated till last, and space those threats out so you're covering a broad area of the board. Sorry, Mark, we interrupted you, Karen, with your the rest of your bit.
I'll happy if you jump in.
Yeah.
I think probably just another couple of things in terms of maintaining your activation count. So one of those would be to not always chain activate. So you've got teams like Vet Guard is one way you can chain activate the Confidant into another guy. That means that you're probably not going to have as many activations before your opponent gets to go at the end. So you might actually in the end give them last activation. Vet Guard have quite a lot though, so that's probably not one of the teams where it's a biggest issue. I would look probably at something like Corsairs. So you've got 9 models. If you chain activate just out of force of habit, say I'm going to chain activate turn 1, all of a sudden you've dropped from 9 activations to 8, and your opponent's going to get more moves at the end of the turn. That's just more agency for them, more freedom. So I would say don't always chain activate out of habit. And then the last thing is to try and keep your models alive even on low wounds. So if you've got a guardsman, he's your last one, the other one's dead, he's still alive on 1 wound. That's actually kind of fine. You don't need to throw him away. You don't need to rush him onto a point or try and take a shot with the las gun because you're trying to do something with him before he dies. You can just keep him alive, so he can just sit there and he's still maintaining your activation count, and that's just going to try and increase the chance that you can go last or just wait out your opponent.
I'm just going to say on chain activate as well, there's so many models that have the can word in it. So Vet Guard Spotter's one, the Recon Drone is another. You can use their special abilities and you don't necessarily have to GA2 with it. And that's kind of the thing of if you want to maintain that activation advantage, which is so important at turning point 1, don't be afraid just to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to wait. Now, it only really works against engaged models because if you telegraph it, people are going to move and deny you that shot. But it's a great way of maintaining your activation advantage throughout the turning point. So understand where you can and when you can't. With GA2 on a data sheet, you can't get around that. But some of the special abilities, you can get around it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And then I'll move on to number 2 if you guys are happy.
Yeah, let's go straight into number 2. Sounds great.
Nice one. So this one is pay more attention to your opponent's pieces than your own. So this is not just in terms of special rules and what your opponent can do, it's also just measuring threat ranges, basically. So we've spoken a little bit about non-reciprocal attacks, trying to set up outside their range. This is basically just every time you've got a plan, this is what I want to do turn 1, this is what I want to do turn 2. What you can very easily do is just get into the habit of, okay, this guy goes here because that's what he needs to do, and this guy's going to go there. But really what you want to be doing is looking more at your opponent's guys and what they're trying to do. So if you're trying to set up just outside of threat range, or maybe they're going to be just outside your threat range, but they're going to be able to attack you, they're not great situations to be in. In particular, one thing I would pick up is if they're going later in turning point 1, they could move dash a guy up so they're in charge range of a guy that you advanced and passed with already. So really you would want to say, I'm going to wait out that guy as long as possible, or if they do move up, I want to measure a move, a dash and a charge away from them. So I had one quite memorable game where I was playing Novitiates into Isaac's Wormblade. So one of my first activations, I moved one of my guys up on the right hand side. He was outside charge range for turn 1, but that set him up nicely for turn 2. So his last activation turn 1, he moved the Wormblade up, and then he got initiative turn 2, charged in, killed a guy, piled in, killed another guy, and then I think that was it at the end, but that was pretty much game over. I kind of lost that flank just because I'd moved up too early and too aggressively, and I was just not measuring the threats that he had and was just focusing too much on my own guys.
Yeah, and that locus will punish you hard with a double kill from the double fight and that sort of stuff. It can be really, really mean. But I think that is a great tip. I can immediately judge, I think, the skill of a player by looking at where they're measuring stuff and what they're looking at, the angles they're looking for. As you say, if they're measuring from your models and going, all right, this guy can move to potentially this bit of cover this turn, and then next turn they can do this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, they know what they're doing. I'm going to have to really, really respect every single one of these movements and make sure that I also measure from them back to make sure that I don't get caught out by something that can be really, really damaging.
Yeah, cool. Moving on to number 3, I've put don't automatically choose the attacker, which you've covered off completely in an earlier episode.
Yep.
So I've got something a little bit different prepared at the last minute. So this is basically look at the maths of the game. So if we're talking about kill team, you're rolling dice. There's a probability to kill every time you roll dice. What you're trying to do is to try and min-max those probabilities. So you want, when you roll dice, you want to make decisions that can capitalise upon good dice and mitigate bad dice. So really what you're trying to do is do the work beforehand. So if we're talking about tournament prep, one of the things I'd be doing is what are the probabilities to kill of my guns into certain enemy profiles. And then that's going to allow you to make informed decisions about the kind of moves that you want to make. I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what you do as well, Ryan.
Yeah, so I'm doing exactly the same thing, and I'm using the kill team calculator an awful lot, because he's even now added the standard deviation that you can expect on your rolls. So people that aren't into probability, if you imagine dice rolls are a bell curve, and the average that we talk about is the middle of that bell curve. The standard deviation is the bit that you see either side, right? So you might flex. So if your average is 4 damage, but your standard deviation is 3, it's like, well, you're either going to do 1 or 7, but you're probably more likely to do 4. It's kind of like the way to look at it. That's a bad example, because there's not many guns that do 1 damage. But the point being is that's a key metric that I'm using. So I get that kill team calculator out, I look at the maths, usually pre-game, and I'll think about what are my odds of killing various things, and then I'll make sure to do stuff that is generically 55% and over happening. If I get to the 60-70% range, that's when I'm thinking these are safe actions, and I'll take risks on about 55%. I generally won't bother doing anything below 50%, because I just don't think it's worth it, unless it's going to change the game or something crazy like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as one thing you've mentioned in the past as well is that you would take this calculator and you just write down what probabilities you're getting against different profiles. So you might say, this is my likelihood if I'm shooting into a guard equivalent, so 7 wounds, 5 up save. And then you might have like 8 wounds, 4 up save, or like a 10 wound model, and then pushing it onto a bit to elites in power armor. So one of the things I've been looking at recently is Vet Guard. And then they've got the plasma gun. That sounds really dangerous because it's plasma, but it only hits on 4s, which isn't great. By comparison to the sniper, you can be hitting on 2s, you can get ceaseless as well. So again, it's pretty much everything. The sniper is better. The one gap comes in at the 10 wound models, where because that only requires 2 hits from the plasma as opposed to mortal wounds or 3 or 4 hits coming in from the sniper. If you were to fight commandos, or if you're firing into hunter clade Sicarians, then the plasma gun is the one you choose, and that's going to let you make a more informed decision about what you want to do in those matchups as well.
Yeah, and that's a really, really great point. It's understanding which weapon is best for this job. And we talked about when selecting kill teams, damage breakpoints. Sometimes that's going to make much more of a difference than, say, a more reliable lower damage shot. Yeah,
for sure. And I think the only other thing I might touch on a little bit is your decision making should shift over the course of the game. So if you're saying, I've got a 55% chance to kill this model, if I'm doing that early in the game, I might be a little bit more cautious about it. But if it's late in the game and you're losing, then you've got to go for it. So you've got to take more aggressive shots. And conversely, if you're winning by quite a lot, you probably want to be a little bit more pessimistic about what you think your output's going to be. So you would, over the course of the game, flex a little bit how aggressive you want to be and what your risk appetite is.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things that we're going to cover in future is going to be how you take risk during the course of the game is really important. So don't take massive high risk plays turn 1, because it can just ruin your later game plan. But on turning point 4, it doesn't matter. Like if you kill the guy, great. If you lose a guy and he's done all his activations anyway, well, it doesn't matter, right? So you can make those really high risk plays on turning point 4, but probably try and avoid them on turning point 1.
Yeah, for sure.
That standard deviation idea is something that's, just because you're going back to what you mentioned earlier, it's something that's new to me, but I'm trying to incorporate in my game, because beforehand I used to look at stats and think, okay, I'll do the maths, I'm going to get 4 damage, and I get 1 damage. I think that's rubbish, that's not it. But then you look at the standard deviation, and actually 68% of all averages are going to fall between that 1 and that 7. So a 1 is actually quite likely, and so is a 7. And trying to reframe my idea of averages less binary and more of like a grade between 1 and 7 with a high probability of 4 is an interesting way of looking at the maths.
Absolutely. Sweet. Let's push on to your fourth tip, Mark. I'm excited to hear what it is.
Yep, sure. So my number 4 would be consider your buffs and synergies. So part of Kill Team is you've got all of these guys with special rules around them. A lot of these can buff guys. Might be guys with 6 inches of you, maybe 3. And to really get the most out of your Kill Team, you're trying to squeeze every little bit out of them. So if you've got this buff, which is going to help your guys out, and you're not utilising that, then that's a missed opportunity. And you're not playing the Kill Team to the maximum potential. So things I'll be considering with buffs and synergies, one of them is you can consider them during deployment. So I'm going to pair together models which I think work together well. So if we jumped back to novitiates again, one of these would be the penitent and the whip lady. So I'm going to stand them close to each other so one can give a buff to the other. And that's something that you can practice on your own as well. So you can prepare beforehand. I'm going to do a practice run and say, these are the kind of things that I want to do during deployment, and these are the kind of pairs of models or maybe a set of 3 models that I want to try and keep together during the course of the game. With those buffs as well, you can correct it to a little bit during your turn. So you can maybe make some move to move within a buff, or you can move out of a buff. Pathfinders, that's something I really like doing, using Monk Car, that free dash, to move within range for Bonder, to take a shot, and then dash away again to get somewhere else I want to be. As well as that, I would try and cover areas, so I might just drop a guy somewhere I need to be, and then that's going to give me that area around it. So I'm not saying I need this guy to be exactly here and this other one needs to be exactly next to it. I'm kind of dropping somebody into a space, and then that's giving me this bubble, and then that's going to give me some flex and options about how I want to try and get other models to benefit from that.
I think as well, like one thing I'll just say on that is this is absolutely huge for min-maxing your own team, but also if you understand these things, the next A-level play is to start denying your opponent their buffs and synergies by killing the correct models in the right way. So if you can see that the model that you need to get rid of to deny a bondage shot on the right guy, and you get rid of them, that can mess with their reliability massively. So the counter to this is understanding what your opponent's buffs and synergies are and how to get rid of them.
I like this point. Can I ask then, Mark, what's your opinion on this? How do you maximize your team's buffs and synergies, but also avoid giving your opponent double kills from, say, like blast or like a double melee charge or something like that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and be a little bit precise in where you're putting guys. So you might, with the first model, you don't need to be as precise, but when you're moving up the second guy to get within that buff range, I generally try and keep within 3 inches, and that's where a lot of the buffs are, but outside of 2. So there's a real sweet spot there. You've got 1 inch to play with to try and avoid that blast range. That does fall apart a little bit now with the Star Striders for that 3 inch blast, which is pretty nasty. And then with multi-charge as well, you can try and keep terrain in the way. So I'm going to have this guy be 3 inches away, and maybe he's a little bit further back, and there's a piece of terrain that's going to stop you getting within 1 inch, or you're going to have to cross it en route, and that's going to penalise your movement enough to stay safe. So it's definitely something to consider to try and get the most out of you guys.
Do not forget
Makes sense to me,
about
James.
those Star Striders and their nasty 3-inch blasts. And Vet Guard as well, they can do the same. Alrighty, what's your last tip for everyone, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So this is be sporting. So one of the things with Kill Team, it's a very complex game now. We've got something like 18 or so bespoke teams, and new teams are coming out all the time. People might not be familiar with even Balanced Data Slate, which came out a week ago. And I think that puts some responsibility on you to try and engage with your opponent and remind them a little bit and give them a bit of a helping hand of, this is what my guys do, here's a bit of a heads up. So before the game's even started, I would generally get my kill team out and make sure my opponent's comfortable with the kind of things they can do. Really what you don't want is during the game to have some kind of gotcha moments. For example, let's say somebody's not played against Vet Guard before and you use a spotter and pop one of their guys turn 1. Or Hunter Clade and you chain activate the Omnis Specs into another guy who's going to ignore obscuring and get a free kill on one of their big guns, which they thought was safe. Those are just really feels bad moments and something that is quite avoidable in a lot of circumstances.
Absolutely. I think that's a two-way thing. That's like, as the player, you want to make sure that you let your opponent know that all those sort of rules that you have, like, by the way, I do have long range blast, by the way, I can ignore obscurity, I can do this, I can do that, and then let them make decisions based on that, but they need to have the information. Then also, if you're against someone else, learn those questions, as we sort of said in the past, so you can ask the right questions when you get to the board and say, do you have any long range blast? Do you have a method to ignore obscurity? And then that can be a way for yourself to not get caught out. And it's why I'm currently trying to play as many teams as possible, because I really want to learn about all the rules and understand what every team does, so that when I sit down at a table against my opponent, I'm hoping to know their team as well as they do, if not better. And then that means that you can avoid any of those gotchas, and then you can inform them about the various things that your own team does. So I think that's a really great bit of advice.
Yeah, I think another couple of small bits I might add to it, quite your team specific. So with a lot of the terrain, things like Octerius, for example, you've got doors on there. It's quite easy to have another guy stood on the opposite side of the door that your opponent can't see. So generally with that, I would try and let the opponent know it's there. So if they make a move, they've obviously forgotten about it, you might tell them. But you can also just put the tokens on top of the building. So this is their order. I'm going to put it on the roof, so you're very aware that they're there. And then I think the only other thing I would pick out is if your opponent's got if you've got some kind of debuff to your opponent. So let's say you've got something like Techno Curse for Galapox. It's a 3-inch range on the small guys, and your opponent might say move up and throw a grenade or something. They're just within 3 inches, so they're getting penalised. So before they roll dice, just remind them, and then if they want to step back just a fraction well within their movement, I'll probably try and be quite accommodating to that. So they're just trying to make decisions in best knowledge of what you've got in terms of special rules. You won't always remember these things, but I think generally these are good habits to try and get into to try and have more enjoyable games as well.
Yeah, and because I think as well, it's what I want to do when I play a game is I want to play against my opponent's best game and not just play them because they didn't know how my team worked. So I think just small things like that, just saying, oh yeah, by the way, this guy has this range on his thing, and then they can make their own decision about it. Maybe they say, oh, I'm setting up for this next turn, or I really want to get or deny you, hold the line, therefore I want to push this guy slightly further over, whatever it is. But you're just giving them that information so then they know what the outcome of it is. And I think that's a really important thing to do. Is that all of the tactical tips that you've got for today, Mark?
That's it for me.
Awesome. That has been pretty epic. And I recommend that if anyone's listened to this, that you just re-listen to all of that again, because you're probably going to have to listen to it twice to make it all really sink in, because there's so much good advice there. And we're definitely going to have to get you back on to talk about more of this stuff, because that's covering a whole load of areas that is really going to improve everyone's game. Anything you want to add in, Conor?
No, but speaking of number 5 be sporting, thank you, Mark. I think you've been very sporting today and given a lot of advice here that I've certainly appreciated, and I hope our listeners will appreciate too.
Cheers, guys. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I think that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. Hopefully to listeners out there, you found something new or useful while listening. And if you did, throwing us a like will be greatly appreciated. If you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes, make sure you hit subscribe so you can get notifications as soon as the next one drops. If you can't wait and you do want some early access, we do have a Patreon where you can get exclusive access to all our content ahead of time, as well as a bunch of other content that we're shoving up there at the moment, with battle reports and our various musings and stuff. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so drop a comment and we'll get right to you. And if you have any questions for future podcasts, make sure you send them in. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Ryan. This has been Turning Point Tactics, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.